Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to dig into something that's been all over the news lately, and honestly, it's pretty confusing, the pause on U.S. support to Ukraine.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
For sure, we've got some excerpts here from a recent CBS News article. It's a good mix of political analysis and reports from folks who are actually, on the ground in Ukraine.
Right, and looking at it all, it seems like things are way more tangled than those quick headlines make it out to be.
Exactly. So to kick things off, I think it's important to start with what we know for sure. President Trump has put a hold on military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine.
That's right. It's important to note that it's not a complete cutoff, though. It's more like a temporary freeze.
Okay, so a pause, not a full stop.
Yeah.
But the big question is why? What's the motivation behind this move? Is it strategic, political, something else entirely?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Even the experts don't seem to have a clear answer. The CBS article mentions Keith Kellogg, the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, basically our main representative there, right?
And even he's calling the situation transitional, which implies that even HE doesn't know the specific conditions for the aid to start flowing again.
That's kind of unsettling, right? If the people directly involved are in the dark, what hope do we have?
It definitely raises some red flags about transparency and, clear communication in U.S. foreign policy. I mean,
Yeah.
what we do know is that diplomatic sources are saying there's no indication this aid is going to be switched back on anytime soon.
Wow.
And we have to remember, this isn't just about money and weapons. We're talking about intelligence sharing, which
Yeah.
is absolutely vital in a war.
Oh, for sure. And speaking of vital intelligence, let's talk about Fiona Hill's take on all this. For those who don't know, she was the senior director for European and Russian affairs on the National Security Council, so she knows her stuff. And she's saying this pause has actually emboldened Russia.
Right, and that's a really worrying thought. Russia tends to see any hesitation or perceived weakness as a green light to push further. Like, they're thinking, hey, if a major supporter of Ukraine is having second thoughts, maybe we've got the upper hand.
Exactly. It could embolden them to take more aggressive actions.
And on the flip side, this must be incredibly demoralizing for Ukraine. I mean, they're in the middle of this incredibly difficult conflict, relying heavily on U.S. support, and then suddenly the rug's pulled out from under them.
It's not just demoralizing, it's strategically crippling, too. The CBS article makes it clear that we're not just talking about financial aid. We've also paused crucial intelligence, sharing things like targeting coordinates for the weapons we've already given them, like those HIMARS systems.
So Ukraine might have the weapons, but without the intel to use them effectively, there's a huge disadvantage.
Think of it like giving someone a race car but then disabling the GPS.
Perfect analogy.
They're basically driving blind.
So we've established that this aid pause has some serious implications for both Russia and Ukraine. But what about the U.S.? What are the potential repercussions for us?
Well, Fiona Hill brings up a really important point. This situation could have a domino effect on how the U.S. shares intelligence with its allies.
How so?
Well, if other countries see that the U.S. can just suddenly halt support without a clear explanation, they might think twice about sharing vital information with us in the future.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's all about trust. If we're seen as unpredictable or unreliable, it could weaken our alliances and our overall position on the global stage.
Absolutely. And all of this is happening against a backdrop of intense diplomatic activity. There's a major meeting happening this week in Saudi Arabia. Secretary of State Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, and Envoy Witkoff are all going to be there meeting with Ukrainian officials.
Okay, but that's where things get even murkier, because nobody seems to know exactly what's on the agenda for this meeting. Is it about restarting the aid, negotiating a peace deal, or something else entirely?
Right, it's all very hush-hush. Some people think it's about reviving a minerals deal, while others believe the U.S. is pushing for a ceasefire and concessions from Ukraine.
So much uncertainty, it's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
It really is. And to make matters worse, we've got these mixed messages coming from the U.S. government itself. On one hand, the U.S. is asking Ukraine for their term sheet for ending the war, basically their conditions for peace. But on the other hand, there's been zero clarity on what, if anything, Russia is offering in return.
Right, and then you've got President Trump, who first hinted at potential sanctions against Russia, but then turned around and downplayed Putin's actions. It's really hard to figure out what his true intentions are.
And this is where Fiona Hill's perspective becomes really important. She believes Trump's words suggest that he sees Ukraine as losing the war and is subtly pushing for their surrender.
So essentially his actions, or in this case inaction, speak louder than any potential sanctions he might impose.
Exactly.
So to recap, we've got this aid pause, a whole lot of diplomatic activity with unclear objectives and mixed signals from the U.S. administration. It's definitely a lot to unpack, and we're just scratching the surface here.
Indeed. This situation is far from simple, and it has these far-reaching consequences that we really need to understand. So let's dive a bit deeper into some of those in the next part of our deep dive.
It's easy to get lost in all the, geopolitical stuff, but we got to remember there are real people in Ukraine whose lives are being turned upside down by this conflict.
Absolutely. While we're here analyzing motives and consequences, there are families being displaced, homes destroyed, lives lost. It's a humanitarian crisis.
The CBS article mentions it, but it's just a glimpse into a much bigger picture.
Right. And it's not just the immediate physical impact. We're talking about the psychological toll, too. The constant fear, the separation from loved ones, not knowing what the future holds. It's incredibly traumatic.
It's easy to feel helpless, especially from so far away. But it's important to remember these are real people with hopes and dreams just like us who are caught in the crossfire.
And their voices deserve to be heard. The article mentions that a lot of Ukrainians feel betrayed by the U.S. like they're pawns in some bigger game.
Which brings us back to that question. What happens if Ukraine does make concessions to appease Russia and get the U.S. back on their side? What kind of message does that send to other countries facing similar threats?
It sets a dangerous precedent, right? If the takeaway is you only get our support if you give something up, it could embolden aggressors all over the world.
They might start seeing concessions as the price of peace, which is a really scary thought.
And what about the impact on the U.S.'s reputation globally? We talked about trust with allies, but what about our adversaries? How do they view this?
Right.
Fiona Hill was spot on when she said this pause could embolden Russia. They might see it as weakness or hesitation on our part.
And that could lead to them taking even bolder actions, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere too.
Exactly. It sends the message that the U.S. might be willing to compromise on its principles, which is not a good look, especially when dealing with someone like Putin.
It's like a chain reaction.
Mhm.
Every decision has these ripple effects that are hard to predict.
It's complex. There's no easy solution. But it's important to acknowledge that complexity and recognize that there are multiple perspectives at play.
It's easy to get bogged down in all the negative aspects, but I think it's important to remember that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
That's so true. The human spirit is incredibly resilient. Even in the face of adversity, people find ways to support each other, rebuild, and keep striving for a better future.
And that's something we shouldn't lose sight of amidst all the political maneuvering and strategic implications. It's the stories of resilience and community that truly inspire us.
Absolutely. They remind us of the power of the human spirit.
So while the situation in Ukraine is still uncertain, let's not forget about that human element, the stories of courage and hope that are coming out of this conflict. It's a powerful reminder that even in the midst of global power struggles, the human spirit endures. This whole situation with Ukraine, it kind of feels like it's brought some bigger issues to the surface, you know?
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected everything is globally, doesn't it? We're
Yeah.
talking about a war in Eastern Europe, but it's tied to U.S. politics, global energy, international diplomacy. It's all linked.
Exactly. It's a reminder that what happens in one corner of the world can have huge ripple effects everywhere else.
And I think it also exposes this growing tension in U.S. foreign policy that's been brewing for a while now.
How so?
Well, on one hand, you have the traditional approach supporting democratic allies, maintaining a strong global presence. But then there's this rising sentiment of wanting to pull back focus inward. You know, America first, avoid getting tangled in foreign conflicts.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. And with elections coming up, I bet this whole Ukraine situation will be a major talking point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how the candidates position themselves on this. Do they advocate for continued support or push for a more isolationist stance?
It's a big question for voters, too. It comes down to what role they want the U.S. to play on the world stage. Do we want to be actively involved in promoting democracy and stability, even if it's risky and costly? Or do we prioritize our own interests and step back from global entanglements?
There's no easy answer. It's a debate that will probably go on long after this specific conflict is resolved.
For sure.
But the important thing is that we're having these conversations, grappling with the complexities and holding our leaders accountable.
I completely agree. We can't just passively absorb the headlines and accept simple narratives. We have to be informed, think critically, and engage in these discussions both with each other and with our elected officials.
Exactly, because ultimately it's our collective understanding and engagement that shapes the direction of our foreign policy and our place in the world.
Well said. I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. We've explored the pause on U.S. aid to Ukraine, the possible motives and consequences, the diplomacy going on behind the scenes, and the impact on the ground.
We also touched on the human cost of this conflict, how interconnected global events are, and those broader questions about U.S. foreign policy that this situation has raised.
It's definitely a lot to digest, and I'm sure our listeners have plenty to ponder as well.
Absolutely.
But if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's stay curious, stay informed, and don't be afraid to question the narratives you're being given. The world is complex, and there are rarely any easy answers.
Well put. And remember, your voice matters. Engage in these conversations, share your perspectives, and make sure you're heard. It's through informed and engaged citizens that we can navigate these challenging times and work towards a more just and peaceful world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.